My life was moving along a predictable path, one I had carefully planned out. Growing up in a small town with big ambitions, I always knew what I wanted: to settle down, start a family, and work with my hands. Becoming a mechanic seemed like the natural choice for me, especially after all those weekends I spent in my father's garage fixing up old cars. Those times really set the foundation for what I'd become. Although the journey wasn't always smooth, Maggie had been at the heart of that dream. She was the girl I admired from a distance back in high school, someone who always seemed just out of reach. When we finally got together, I was determined to make it last. We had big plans, like buying a house and starting a family. But life doesn't always follow the plan, and soon, things started to fall apart. Now, sitting in my truck, I stared at the old trailer up ahead. I had been sitting here for nearly 20 minutes, lost in my thoughts. The mailbox still had the name, Kendall, on it, but the driveway was empty where my car used to sit. If Maggie still lived here, she would be at work by now. A part of me wondered whose car might show up later. It definitely wouldn't be Nick's. He thought too highly of himself to hang around in this part of town. Anger started rising inside me, and I almost drove away. I questioned why I had taken this delivery, coming back here when I had sworn I would never return. But just as I was about to leave, I noticed a swing set and a sandbox full of toys. The sight hit me hard, and I had to blink back tears. Emma would be nearly 4 now. My daughter, whom I had not seen in years. I remembered the last time I had been here, 2 years ago, on July 3rd. That day changed everything. Maggie and I had fought about a party I refused to attend. That argument marked the end of my life as I had known it. I hadn't returned since. We had been saving up for a house in Aspen Meadows, dreaming of a perfect future. But we were young, in love, and wrapped up in a fantasy. Maggie was working as a receptionist for a construction firm, and I was the lead mechanic at the local Ford dealership. At 24, I was the youngest but fully qualified with a good salary. Together, we saved a bit of every paycheck. Maggie had always been popular, the cheerleader type, always dating the football stars. She was beautiful and well-known, constantly surrounded by attention. I finally got to meet her by chance when she came to the dealership with her dad, Paul Reynolds, a well-off man in town. Maggie was turning 18 and was there to pick out her birthday car. She was stunning, and when she checked out a Mustang convertible, I knew I couldn't miss my chance to say hello. When she looked up, I smiled and asked, "Need any help?" She mistook me for a salesman and pointed to her dad. "He wants me to get a sedan, but I really like this one." "How much more is it?" "It's about the same price since the one he picked has all the options. This one's stripped down to keep the cost low, but it has more power and looks much better. Just tell him the price is the same and see what he says." "What's missing?" she asked. "No power seats, no satellite radio, no leather, and none of the extras. But it has what you need: air conditioning, power steering, windows, and locks." She thought for a moment, and then went back to talk to her dad. After discussing with him, she came back to me. "The sedan's more practical, and I like the extras. The convertible is cute, but it's not for me." I agreed with her. We chatted for a bit, and I introduced myself as the mechanic. She smiled and told me her name was Maggie. After some more conversation, I gathered my courage and asked her out, and to my surprise, she said yes. That marked the beginning of the best summer of my life. We dated all through the summer and fall. Maggie decided to go to a tech school for nursing instead of heading off to college. Despite her parents' objections, she earned her license and explored job opportunities at hospitals, but she ended up finding fewer hours and better pay at a construction company. After 6 months, she moved into an apartment with a friend, craving independence. Her dad mentioned that they were disappointed, but Maggie was firm in her decision, telling them to spend their money on themselves. We kept dating, though it wasn't exclusive. Maggie wasn't ready for anything serious yet, and said she wanted to stay single until she found the one. I hoped that person would be me, but I didn't push her. Over time, she stopped seeing other guys as often, and I felt ready to propose. I made an offer on a double-wide trailer in a nice park just outside of town. Once it was officially mine, I moved in, planning to surprise Maggie with a proposal. That evening, I drove to her apartment only to see her getting out of a car with Nick Fletcher, a guy she worked with at the construction company. I sat in my car, watching as they walked to her door. She had never let me come up after our dates, saying her roommate would not like it. At the door, she and Nick exchanged a few words, and then he pulled her in close. I almost jumped out of the car right then, but I held back, watching as she kissed him and let his hands wander over her. My stomach turned. I walked toward them, and when she spotted me, she shoved Nick away. I did not give her a chance to speak. I grabbed Nick, punched him square in the mouth, and watched as he stumbled back, blood dripping from his lip. Maggie screamed and rushed to his side, cradling his head in her lap. I stood there, fuming, watching her comfort Nick while he bled. I could not take it anymore. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the ring box I had planned to give her and hurled it at her. I was done. I did not care about the ring anymore. I just needed to throw something. It bounced off her shoulder, and I spat out. I've almost made the worst mistake of my life. I hope you get what you want, but it will not be me. Tears were on the edge of spilling over as I ran back to my car, slammed my foot on the gas, and sped away. When I got back to my trailer, I sat in the darkness, overwhelmed with rage and heartbreak, trying to figure out how I had gotten it all so wrong. I thought she loved me the way I loved her, but what I had just witnessed told a different story. I finally dragged myself to bed around dawn, completely drained, and I slept until midday. It was Sunday, and with Maggie gone, I had nothing lined up. After a shower, I felt a little better, but as I stood under the hot water, I suddenly felt someone behind me. Maggie had slipped into the shower, wrapping her arms around me. I pushed her away, turned off the water, and shouted, "What do you think you are doing? I saw you with Nick. He had his hands all over you, and you did not stop him." She stood there, not backing down, with a slight smirk on her face. "You did not see everything. I told him it was not going to happen between us, and he got upset. I was just trying to get inside to end it when you showed up." "That is a lie," I shot back. "I saw you kiss him and hold on to him. If you wanted him, you could have just told me. I would have stepped aside, even if it hurt." "You are wrong, Jessie," she insisted. "You are the only one I want. If my words cannot convince you, then take me now. Make me yours." I hesitated, torn between desire and the memory of her telling me she wanted to wait until marriage. Could I trust her after what I had seen? Had my interruption stopped something worse, or was she being truthful? I looked at her pleading face and made a choice. I told her I believed her, but I could not accept her offer. Knowing what that meant to her, she smiled softly and left that evening. Despite my doubts, I still planned to propose. I pushed aside the nagging thoughts of where she had spent the night. When I arrived at her place, she said yes, and I forgot about everything else. We got married, and she moved into the trailer with me. We kept saving for a house. A year later, Maggie got pregnant, and Emma was born 9 months after that. Maggie went back to work 6 months later, and we continued saving. I picked up overtime shifts whenever I could, and we were finally getting close to having enough for a down payment. Emma, now almost 2, needed her own room, and I was excited about the future. We were just waiting for the right house to hit the market. I was exhausted from all the work and did not have the energy to go out much. I thought Maggie understood that. We had a few arguments, but she usually backed down, knowing we were working toward our dream home. She occasionally went out with her friends, and even though I did not love it, I could not complain since she always came home early. But everything changed the day before July 4th. After working extra hours, all I wanted was a hot shower, a cold beer, and a relaxing weekend with my family. When I got home around 4, Maggie's car was already in the driveway. I grabbed a beer and headed to the deck, ready to unwind. As I sat there relaxing, Maggie came out, dressed up to go somewhere, which took me by surprise. I also noticed Emma was not around. "Where's Emma?" And why are you all dressed up? I asked, still not fully processing what was happening. Maggie crossed her arms and replied, Emma is staying with my mom tonight. We are going to a party at the park. The company is hosting it for the fireworks, and there are special seats for employees and their families. We need to hurry. I told you I wanted to stay home and rest, I said, feeling the exhaustion in my bones. I am wiped out from all the overtime, and I cannot stand your work crowd, especially Nick. I never get to go out anymore. She shot back. You are always working, and we hardly see you. We have not even been intimate in weeks. I am going out tonight, with or without you. Fine, I muttered, but I am not going to that party. We can go to dinner or watch the fireworks by the river like we used to, I suggested. No, I want to be with my friends tonight, whether you come along or not, she snapped back. I am going, so do not wait up. With that, Maggie walked out, leaving me standing there, frustrated and angry. I had no intention of chasing after her, and I sure was not about to hang around Drake and his crowd. I went back inside, grabbed something to eat, but the emptiness I felt was not hunger. It was the absence of my wife and daughter. The quiet evening I had hoped for turned into a lonely one. Eventually, I laid down on the couch and dozed off. I woke up to the sound of fireworks around 8:30 and realized I was still alone. After taking the shower I had been wanting earlier, I decided to head over to Towner's Bar and Grill, where I figured Maggie would be. The thought of her being with Drake made me uneasy, and I felt like I had to see what was going on. I arrived just before 10 o'clock and bumped into Janie and Jake Cummings outside. When I asked if they had seen Maggie, they exchanged nervous looks. Jake warned me that Drake was making a move on her, and this time, she was not stopping him like she usually did. His buddies were keeping her friends away. Inside, I saw Maggie and Drake sitting close together, his hand hidden under the table. Maggie looked drunk. I walked up and yelled, Maggie, what are you doing with this guy? Let's go home. Before I could react, two guys grabbed me, and Drake swung a punch, hitting me square in the face. I saw stars, barely keeping myself from collapsing as they held me up. Maggie just sat there, faintly smiling. Fueled by pure anger, I managed to kick Drake in the face, but another guy stepped in and started slapping me until I passed out. When I came to, I was slumped in my car, covered in blood, with bruised ribs and a body that ached all over. Some guy nearby told me to leave, saying Maggie was Drake's for the night and threatening me if I came back. Realizing I had no chance, I drove home, took another shower, and stared at my battered reflection in the mirror. As I sat in my living room, I thought about the night. Maggie had always agreed to skip those company parties because of Drake, and she knew I needed rest after working all those overtime shifts. But tonight, she went out anyway, and when I came to bring her home, she stood by while I got beaten. My anger boiled over. I even considered getting a weapon or sneaking into Drake's place later that night, but both options would only end with me in jail. Neither was worth it. I had no choice but to wait for Maggie to come home and decide what to do next. Divorce seemed like the most obvious solution, but it came with serious consequences. First, I would be labeled as the guy who got cheated on, and the whole town would know. Second, with her family's money, I risked losing everything, including custody of Emma. I could not stay and face that humiliation, so divorce was out, at least for now. As the sun began to rise, it became clear that Maggie had spent the night with Drake. No calls, no explanations. There was no doubt about what had happened. Worse, nobody in town had stepped in to help me, proving that Drake had control over everyone, and I meant nothing to anybody, not even my wife. With that realization, I made up my mind. I was not going to divorce her because that would free her to be with Drake, and I could not risk him getting custody of Emma. No, they would have to live in their mess, and Emma would still be my daughter, even if I could not be there. I left Maggie the money we had saved for the house, and I planned to send half of my salary every month to support Emma. This way, Maggie could never claim I had abandoned them or that I was not providing for my daughter. If she filed for divorce, I would fight for custody, but in the meantime, I would do what I could as a father until Emma was grown. An hour later, I packed up and left town. My heart was shattered, and I was hurting, but I could not stay and face more humiliation. Maggie had made her choice, and now I was making mine, leaving her to explain to our daughter why I was not there anymore. After driving all day, I stopped at a motel for the night, and then continued the next morning. My whole body ached, and my head was pounding, but by the third day, I was 1,000 miles away, in a new town. I found a free clinic and got checked out. The doctor told me I had a mild concussion, cracked ribs, and a bunch of bruises, but I would be fine. I asked him if he knew where a master mechanic could find work, and he pointed me toward Josh Fields, a guy who ran a custom car dealership. I was lucky to get the job. Josh specialized in luxury cars and needed someone with my skills to restore and resell them. We got along well, and he paid me fairly for my work. At the end of that first month, I cashed my paycheck, kept a third for myself, and sent the rest to Maggie, making sure it could not be traced back to me. I repeated this process every 2 weeks for the next 2 years, each time sending more money from different locations, ensuring I stayed off the radar after that first letter, which included a note explaining why I left and that the money was meant for Emma. I never added any more words, just cash. I wanted it clear that the money was strictly for my daughter's care, so no one could say I was shirking my responsibilities. I found a small, affordable apartment close to work and slowly furnished it with second-hand items. It eventually became a cozy bachelor pad, and I began rebuilding my life, determined to make things better. That night still haunted me, the night I failed to defend myself, so I enrolled in a martial arts class, training hard so I could protect myself if it ever came to that again. I also took the car-related courses Josh recommended. I learned that a lot of foreign cars were mostly hype, and I often saved Josh money by finding equivalent parts. Josh and I became good friends, and he trusted me with deliveries, knowing I could handle talking to customers and explaining the details of their cars. Customers seemed to like me, and it helped both Josh and me in the long run. As time passed, I made new friends and started going out more. One bar I frequented had a group of women who came by regularly. Eventually, I struck up a conversation with one of them, a beautiful redhead named Stephanie. We hit it off right away, both of us dealing with difficult marriages. Her husband had left her, and she was waiting for the legal process to divorce him. At first, I told Stephanie I was just separated, but over time, I opened up about Maggie and Emma. She understood, and after a while, she introduced me to her 2-year-old son, Billy. Stephanie and I began dating, and things quickly got serious. I found myself truly happy with her and her son, enjoying their company and letting our relationship grow naturally. We talked for hours, and it wasn't long before we became physically intimate. Our time together was sweet, and I realized I had never felt this way before, not even with Maggie. We spent more and more time together, and when Billy stayed with friends, Stephanie would spend the night with me. Those nights were some of the best I had ever experienced, filled with love, deep conversation, and true companionship. One morning, after a night with Stephanie, it hit me just how much I cared for her. That was when I realized it was really over between Maggie and me. A few weeks later, Josh had a Mercedes sedan from Germany that needed to be delivered. I had worked on it, installing an air conditioner, tuning the engine, and making sure everything was in top shape. Josh asked if I wanted to handle the delivery. It would be a 3-day trip, and I figured it would be a good distraction since Stephanie was visiting her mother for the week. I missed her and Billy, so the trip seemed like a way to pass the time, plus there was a bonus involved. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the delivery's destination, but when I saw it was my old town, the place I had run from, it hit me. Did I really want to go back? Life was good now with Stephanie, and my job was solid. I had nearly forgotten the pain Maggie had caused, but I decided it was time to face the past. I also wanted to see my daughter again and finally settle the divorce. I left the next day, unsure of how I felt. When I arrived, I delivered the car to Carl Cunningham, the owner of the construction company and Drake's father. He had no idea who I was. I swallowed my anger, knowing Carl likely had no clue what kind of person his son was. His estate was massive, and after I backed the car off the flatbed, Carl gave it a thorough inspection. We went for a test drive, and I handed over the paperwork. During the drive, Carl casually mentioned that the car was a gift for Drake, who was trying to impress some woman. He mentioned that she was married but her husband had left, and now Drake was spending all his time with her. I kept quiet, realizing Carl was talking about Maggie. He seemed like a decent man, completely unaware of what Drake was really up to. Carl probably thought Drake was doing right by this woman, not knowing the real story. I just nodded and finished the deal. He gave me a cashier's check, and I left. On impulse, I drove to my old neighborhood and parked near the trailer I used to call home. I sat there, unsure of what to do next, with all kinds of thoughts running through my mind. It seemed that with me gone, Drake had finally gotten what he wanted with Maggie. Maybe that night at the bar wasn't the first time, and maybe she didn't need to get drunk for it to happen. What I had chalked up to too much drinking might have just been her doing what she wanted all along. Now, 2 years later, I sat there, staring at my past, trying not to let it overwhelm me. Seeing that swing set and those toys brought back some pretty painful memories. I felt a panic attack coming on. I was sweating, my face felt flushed, and I was struggling to catch my breath. I calmed myself by taking deep breaths and forcing my mind to focus on more technical thoughts, trying to regain control. Just as I started to relax a bit, her van came into view, pulling into the driveway. It was the same old Toyota, same license plate as before. I slumped down in my truck, not wanting her to notice me. Maggie got out, looking cheerful, and headed inside without even glancing around. I wondered if she was working, though with the money I had been sending her, she probably didn't need to. A few minutes later, her mom's Mercedes pulled up, and I watched as Grace helped Emma out of the car. My heart sank seeing my daughter rush into the house. I stayed there for another 20 minutes, watching as Emma came back outside to play on the swing with another little girl. The sight hit me hard. I missed her so much, and it was clear how much she had grown in the 2 years I had been gone. Driving away from her again felt impossible, and tears filled my eyes as I pulled out and headed to a Motel 6. I checked in with cash, avoiding credit cards that could be traced. I wasn't ready for Drake or anyone else to know I was back in town, though maybe that would change soon. The pain of losing my daughter, of not being part of her life, weighed heavily on me. In that motel room, I replayed all my humiliations, letting the anger simmer. By 10 that night, I couldn't contain it anymore. The fire inside me had taken over, and I drove straight to Towner's Bar and Grill, fully aware that Drake and his crew would likely be there. When I arrived, I spotted them at a table in the back, and a surge of anticipation hit me. Easing the pain gnawing at me for so long, the bar was quiet. That worked in my favor. I ordered a beer and kept an eye on Drake's table through the mirror behind the bar, waiting for things to unfold. Soon enough, someone pointed me out to Drake, and I saw him glance my way. I smiled, knowing things were about to get interesting. My martial arts training had taught me 2 important lessons: patience and how to harness anger as a controlled tool. Ever since Carl had mentioned Drake and Maggie, that anger had been burning inside me, and now it was white hot, fueling my resolve. Drake sent one of his guys over first. The man put his hand on my shoulder and sneered. "Aren't you the chicken who ran off and left your wife and kid? Jesse Chicken Prentice, right?" Without even setting down my beer, I turned and gave him a smile. "That's me. What can I do for you?" He chuckled and walked back to Drake, who stood up and headed my way. I placed my beer down and steadied myself, planting my feet firmly. Position and anticipation were everything in a confrontation, and I was ready. Glancing over my shoulder at the bartender, I said, "Make sure you remember who starts this, Jim. I'm not looking for trouble, but I want you as a witness." Jim nodded. "I hear you, Jesse. Just be careful." "Count on it," I replied, closing my eyes for a second and focusing on my training. My sensei's words echoed in my mind. "Do not think, just let your body react." And it was time to do just that. There were 4 of them, just like that night when my life changed. My training had focused on reactive defense, using the opponent's aggression and energy against them. My sensei always said I was good at it, and now I had the chance to prove it for real. As Drake and his crew closed in, I stayed calm, sitting at the bar with my arms relaxed, my back against the counter. My mind was clear, but the anger burned hot inside me, waiting for the right moment. Drake stopped just out of arm's reach, sneering at me, taunting me about Maggie. Well, if it isn't the coward who ran off and let me have his wife. She's been mine, Jesse. You weren't around to stop me. I said nothing, just watched him closely, waiting. His words stoked the fire inside, but I remained in control, focused. One of his guys was the only real threat, the rest were just background noise. Drake kept going. Why don't you run back to whatever hole you crawled out of? Maggie's with me now, and there's nothing you can do about it. His words stung, but I realized he might actually believe them. This was his territory now, but I wasn't going to let him win. I pushed down my anger, knowing it was time to hit him where it hurt. You're delusional, Drake. Maggie always had better taste than that. She felt sorry for you. That's all. You're just a loser who needs backup to get a woman. Do you need your boys to help you in bed too? His face twisted with anger, just as I had hoped. He grabbed me by the collar, and I let him pull me forward, using his momentum against him. I shoved him backward, and he lost his balance, crashing to the floor with a hard thud, clearly dazed. His friends hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Two of Drake's guys hurried over to pull him up. His face was flushed with rage, but I knew at that moment that the fight was already over. I had him. Drake charged at me, arms out, trying to grab hold of me. I quickly sidestepped, caught his arm, and yanked him toward the bar. His face slammed into the edge with a sickening crunch. He crumpled to the floor in a pool of blood, his nose broken, teeth scattered, and his shoulder probably dislocated. But I didn't focus on Drake. I kept my eyes on the others. The guy I had been watching, the one who had mocked me about Maggie, cursed and stepped forward, pulling his arm back for a punch. He was the one who had laughed about Drake and Maggie, and I wasn't just going to stop him, I was going to make sure he paid. He threw a punch, but I dodged it easily, letting him hit nothing but air. He swung again, but this time I caught his arm, twisted it, and used my weight to pull him down. His arm smashed against the stool with a loud snap, and he let out a scream. His arm had broken just below the elbow. As he staggered back, I drove a hard strike into his chest and followed it up with a swift kick to the groin, knocking him out cold. Just to be sure, I kicked him in the head and stomped on his groin a few more times. Goodbye to your family, Jules, I thought. My sensei would have been proud, though I resisted the urge to finish him off. 2 down, 2 to go. The remaining guys were more cautious now, trying to flank me, but fear was evident in their eyes. They had no choice but to confront me, and I could tell they were scared. I closed my eyes briefly, anticipating their next move. When they came at me, I grabbed both by their heads and slammed them together. They hit the floor unconscious. With all 4 of them down, I walked back over to Drake and gave him a solid kick between the legs, just for good measure. He didn't respond, but it felt satisfying. I returned to the bar, took a slow sip of my beer, and savored the moment. I hadn't even broken a sweat. Jim, the bartender, stood there, staring at me in shock. Jesse, I've never seen anything like that. How did you do it? They didn't stand a chance. His words reignited an anger in me, not toward Drake this time, but toward the town that had stood by and done nothing when I needed help. I turned to Jim, who had watched it all happen 2 years ago, just like everyone else. Just like that night, right, Jim? Nobody stepped in to help me. Not you, not my so-called friends, not even my wife. Well, I'll never let that happen again. Tell everyone to stay away from me unless I say otherwise. They'll regret it if they don't. Jim muttered. Where are you going, Jesse? What should I tell them? I'll be at the Motel 6. I'm leaving tomorrow at dawn, so if anyone wants to talk, they better hurry. With that, I left the bar and returned to the motel. I had expected to feel victorious after confronting Drake and his gang, but instead, I felt empty. His taunts about Maggie still stung, reopening the wounds I thought had healed. My revenge felt hollow, and the pain of losing Maggie and Emma came flooding back. I sat in the motel room, replaying that night from 2 years ago. Why did I run? I had my reasons, but deep down, I always knew the truth. My marriage was over the moment Maggie chose Drake. Still, that didn't make losing my daughter any easier. As I sat there, lost in thought, there was a knock at the door. Expecting the police, I opened it, but it was Jake Cummings. He had been the one who tried to warn me that night. I nodded and let him in, grateful that at least he had made an effort. "Hello, Jake. Long time no see. How are you and Janie?" "We're okay." I figured it didn't hurt to be polite, since I was leaving the next morning anyway. "Jesse, I heard what you did at Towner's. Jim called and told me everything. Have you seen Maggie? She's been losing her mind not knowing where you went. She even hired a private investigator, but no one could find a trace of you." I just stared at him. Why would I have wanted anyone to know where I was? I made sure no one could find me for a reason. So why tell you now? I shook my head and tried to explain. "What did you think, Jake? That I'd stay after what she did with Drake? After he and his guys knocked me around while everyone watched, including Maggie? I saw the smile on her face when it happened. I knew right then it was over. She and this town can have each other. I came back to do a job, and now I'm leaving, going back to where I'm respected." Jake listened and shook his head, but I didn't care. I appreciated that he had at least tried to help me that night, though. "Jake, you were the only one who tried, and I thank you for that. But now I need you to leave me alone." Jake didn't move. I was about ready to tell him to leave when he sat down, crossing his arms. "No, you're going to hear me out first." I sighed. "Fine. Say what you need to, and then go." That night, Janie and I tried to get Maggie away from Drake. We had the car ready to go, but she wouldn't come with us. She told us she was going to find you and make Drake let you go. That was the last we saw of her. The next day, we went by your trailer, and it was empty. We tried calling Maggie all day, and when we finally tracked her down, she was a mess. When she couldn't find you, she lost it. We had to take her to the hospital because of exhaustion. I was surprised by this, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that Maggie had brought it all on herself. She had chosen to be with Drake that night, after all. But Jake kept going. After she got out of the hospital, Maggie quit her job at the construction company and filed a complaint against Drake. He paid her to drop the charges and keep quiet. She took a job at the hospital after that, and she never stopped trying to find you. We all felt guilty for not doing more that night. Jake paused before continuing. "Maggie knows you're back. I told her after Jim called me. She wants to see you, but she's scared. She knows she messed up and that she's responsible for you leaving and for what happened that night. She had no intention of staying with Drake. A lot of it was just bravado. When the fight broke out, things got out of control, and you were gone before she could do anything." Jake looked uncomfortable as he finished. "She never explained where she went that night or admitted to anything. But we chose to believe her, Jesse. We think you should too." He stood up and headed for the door. "I don't know what to tell you, Jesse. Maggie loves you, and Emma misses you. It's up to you now. I wish you the best." I walked him to the door. "I hear you, Jake, and I appreciate it. But Maggie made her choice that night. She knew exactly how I felt about Drake, and she still went out with him. She defied me and did something no married woman should do. She went to a bar with another man and drank too much. Don't try to make me the villain here." Jake gave me a sad look. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. You know her better than anyone. Just make sure you make the right choice for yourself." He left, and the door clicked shut with a heavy thud in the silence. I sat on the bed, my head in my hands. I knew Jake was right in some ways, but my anger was still burning inside me. I wasn't sure I could ever forgive Maggie, especially not in this town where Drake and his family held all the power. Coming back here would only bring more trouble, maybe even for me. It was nearly midnight, and I felt restless after the fight. I decided to take a drive to Cayman Estates, the neighborhood where Maggie and I had once dreamed of buying a house. As I drove through the gates, I couldn't help but think of all the plans we had made, decorating a yard for Emma and maybe more kids down the line. All of those dreams had crumbled the moment Maggie chose Drake. Tears welled up as I drove, and I had to pull over to get control of myself. The memories of what could have been were too painful to bear. This trip hadn't brought me any closure, just more heartache. I realized it was time to head back to where my real life was now, with Stephanie and her son, where people truly cared about me. But I couldn't shake the love I still had for Emma. I needed to figure out a way to resolve that, though maybe not tonight. I decided to pack up, leave the motel, and head home. Maybe it was time to file for divorce and let Maggie move on with Drake. But just thinking about that made me angrier. I slammed my fist into the steering wheel. No, this ends now, I muttered to myself. I turned the truck toward Maggie's trailer. It was time to confront her and finally make some decisions. When I pulled up a few houses down, I saw her van parked in the driveway. I turned off the engine, ready to put an end to all of this. As I sat there, all my old anger and doubts came rushing back. I took a few minutes to calm myself down, scolding myself for feeling weak. Once I felt more in control, I stepped out of the truck and walked up to the door, reminding myself that this wasn't my home anymore. The porch was in need of repairs, but that wasn't my problem now. Even though I had worked so hard to buy this place for Maggie and Emma, her choices had caused it to fall apart. I knocked on the door, and when it opened, it wasn't Maggie who stood there, it was her mother, Grace. I hadn't expected to see her, especially since her car wasn't there. "Jessie, is that really you?" she gasped. "Come in. Where have you been? What happened?" Before I could react, Grace pulled me inside. I followed her into the small living room, the one I used to take such pride in. She motioned for me to sit, and I did, still trying to process why Grace was here. Grace had never really liked me. She always thought Maggie had married below her station. Yet here she was, acting like she was glad to see me. "Where's Emma?" I asked, cutting to the chase. "Is Maggie out with Drake? Heard he had a little accident." I couldn't help but snicker at the memory of Drake's encounter with the bar. Grace's face reddened, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to see my daughter and settle things with Maggie once and for all. Grace explained. "Maggie's out. She asked me to watch Emma. She'll be back around midnight." I responded with sarcasm. "I'm sure Drake's taking real good care of her. Maggie chose him over me, right? You must be thrilled." Grace's face tightened with anger, but again, I didn't care. I had made up my mind. I'd see Emma, then I'd be on my way. Maggie had moved on, and it was time to make things official. I walked down the hallway to Emma's room. She was fast asleep, clutching a blue bunny, her hair spread out across the pillow. My heart ached just looking at her, and I felt tears well up. I stood there for a moment, lost in the sight of her, until Grace came up behind me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "She's missed you, Jessie. Almost as much as Maggie has. You broke their hearts when you left." I turned to face Grace, sensing she had more to say. She motioned for me to follow her back to the living room. "Come sit and hear me out," she said. "If you decide to leave after, that's your choice. But if you don't listen, you'll prove me right about you." I gave Emma one last look and then followed Grace down the hall. I sat in the chair I used to watch TV in, ready to hear whatever Grace had to say. I didn't care much for her opinion, and I never had. I figured she'd just blame me for everything. Leaning back, I nodded. "Go ahead, Grace. You can blame me all you want. I never cared what you thought." Grace frowned but started speaking. "I need to tell you what really happened that night, and what happened after you left. You don't know what Maggie and Emma went through." I crossed my arms, ready for the lecture. Grace continued. "I'll be honest, Jessie. I never thought you were the right man for Maggie. I always figured she'd end up with someone like Drake, rich, from an important family. But Maggie always said she'd rather die than be with someone like him. I laughed bitterly. Drake didn't want to marry her, Grace. He just wanted to sleep with her. Grace snapped back. Typical language from you, Jesse. I didn't respect you, and yes, I thought you were beneath her. But after she married you and had Emma, I could see she was happy. That's when I started to think I might have been wrong about you. Her voice softened a bit. Then you left them. I was furious. Maggie was devastated, but she wouldn't let me blame you. She even snapped at me when I tried to badmouth you. I didn't understand it. I was getting impatient. No surprise there, Grace. Maggie didn't let you badmouth me, and you couldn't figure out why. Grace waved her hand, cutting me off, her eyes flashing with anger. Maggie told me the truth. She explained how you stood up to Drake, and how his friends jumped you after you punched him in self-defense. Later, I heard from one of Drake's buddies that they threatened to eliminate you if you tried to stop them from taking Maggie. I was surprised she knew all that. I hadn't thought anyone knew what was said in the parking lot. Still, it didn't change the facts. So you know, Maggie caused all this with her actions. She chose to go out and party instead of staying loyal to me. When I left, I believed she was with Drake, and I couldn't stay here if that was true. No one saw her that night, and she didn't come home until the afternoon the next day. Where was she, Grace? Did she ever tell you? Grace looked shocked, shaking her head as if she had no idea. Well, now you know. She went out without me, got drunk, and ended up at that bar with Drake. When I confronted her, she laughed at me. I could have handled getting knocked around, but the humiliation of what was happening was too much. I believe she spent the night with him. This all reminded me of the time I had proposed to Maggie. Suddenly it hit me. It was the same situation. She had probably spent the night with Drake back then too, only to come back to me and act innocent. As I sat there, in the chair I used to relax in, I prepared myself to listen to the rest of Grace's story. I didn't care much for her thoughts on me, but I knew she wanted to get it all out. Go ahead, Grace, I said. Say what you need to say. I know you never thought I was good enough for Maggie. Grace frowned again, but she began. I need to tell you what happened that night and afterward. You left, and Maggie and Emma went through a lot. You have no idea, Grace began. I never thought you were right for her. I always believed she'd end up with someone like Drake, wealthy, well-connected. But Maggie always rejected him. She told me she'd rather die than marry him. I couldn't help but laugh. Drake didn't want to marry her, Grace. He just wanted to sleep with her. Grace snapped back. You always disrespect her. And to be honest, I never respected you either. But after you two married and had Emma, I saw how happy Maggie was. I started to think maybe I was wrong about you. Her tone softened as she continued. Then you left, and I was furious with you. But Maggie wouldn't let me speak badly about you. She was heartbroken. I couldn't understand it. I was getting impatient, but Grace kept going. Maggie told me the truth later. She explained how you stood up to Drake that night, and only hit him in self-defense. Afterward, his friends jumped you, and then they threatened you in the parking lot, saying they'd eliminate you if you tried to stop them from taking her. I was surprised she knew that much, but I wasn't going to let it change my perspective. So, you know, Grace, Maggie brought this all on herself. She went out without me, drank too much, and ended up with Drake. When I saw her laughing at me that night, it was clear she had made her choice. I left because I believed she spent the night with him. Grace looked startled and shook her head, clearly unsure of what had really happened that night. Well, now you know. Maggie chose to be with Drake. She humiliated me, and I couldn't stay here if that was the case. I believe she stayed with him that night, and honestly, it probably wasn't the first time. As I sat down, I remembered the night I proposed to Maggie. Suddenly, I realized it could have been the same situation back then, her seeing Drake and acting innocent afterward. Grace, calmer now, said, You're wrong, Jesse. Maggie told me she never liked Drake. He always chased after her, but she didn't want him. She even asked his father to get him to stop, She loves you, Jesse. She's unhappy now, and the only thing she truly cares about is Emma. She may go out with friends occasionally, but she always comes home early. She's been saving every penny you've sent for Emma's future and hasn't touched a single dime of the money you two saved together. Grace stood up, grabbing her purse. I'm leaving now, Jesse. You'll have to stay with Emma until Maggie gets back. I'll take the van, and she'll return it tomorrow. That van's in bad shape without you around to keep it running. Good night, Jesse. Before I could respond, Grace left, leaving me with no choice but to wait for Maggie. As I sat there, I mulled over what Grace had said. It didn't all add up. I knew that van was in perfect condition when I left, and Maggie didn't need to work. The money I sent was more than enough to cover her living expenses. If she had the money, why hadn't she bought a new car? It was hard to believe she wasn't going out and partying like she used to. Grace didn't know everything, and Maggie had always been good at fooling her. I sat back, thinking about how I wanted to confront Maggie. Needing a distraction, I went to check on Emma again. She was still fast asleep, looking so peaceful, and I felt a wave of emotions wash over me just standing there. I stayed by her side until the clock struck 1. Maggie still hadn't come home, which didn't surprise me. I figured she was with Drake, probably at the hospital after the bar fight. Just as I was about to grab something to eat, I heard a car pull up. It was Grace's car, followed by an older Mercedes, the same one I had delivered earlier to Drake's father. Maggie got out of Grace's car, and a man from the Mercedes handed her something, probably the keys. He then walked back to the waiting car, and Maggie waved as it drove away. When Maggie came inside, I could see she had changed. She was slimmer, her hair longer and shinier, and she wore a much shorter, tighter dress than she used to. Her face had that starry-eyed look she always had after a night of drinking and dancing. This wasn't the sad, heartbroken woman Grace had described. "Hello, Jesse. It's been a long time. How are you?" she said softly, in a tone I didn't recognize. I wasn't sure what to say. This was a different Maggie, more like the one I knew before we got married. I had to be careful. "Hello, Maggie. I'm fine. It's been over 2 years since I was last here. The night you went out partying without me. I'm sure you remember." She sat down on the couch, took off her coat, and looked at me. "Yes, Jesse, I remember that night. I can't forget it. I see you in my mind getting dragged outside. That's all I remember before Jake and Janie pulled me out the back door." That was her first lie, and I knew now how she was going to play this, so I decided to push her a little. "They knocked me around pretty bad that night, Maggie. I had a concussion, broken ribs, and bruises. And after they knocked me out, they told me, 'Your wife belongs to Drake tonight. You'll get her back tomorrow.' They said if I tried to stop them, they'd drive me into the lake. That's what happened, Maggie." I watched her face closely, but she didn't react. I continued, "I wasn't going to die for you, since you had clearly chosen Drake. So, I went home and waited. You never came back. Never called. Not a word. By morning I realized you had been with him all night, and I couldn't live with that shame. So I left." Tears welled up in her eyes as she listened, but when she started crying, I could see the tears weren't real. Her eyes still held that same contempt. "Nothing happened, Jesse. I was with Jake and Janie the whole time. I tried to call you, but I couldn't get through. By the time they brought me back to the trailer, you were already gone." I shook my head. "Why would you expect me to stay? You went to that bar with Drake, sat with him, let him touch you, and when you saw me, you smiled, a smile of satisfaction. I waited all night for you, Maggie. You never called, and Jake told me you didn't leave with them. They didn't see you again until the next day. You're lying." She looked away, trembling, but I kept going. "As I waited in that trailer that night, I remembered the time I was going to propose to you. You were with Drake then too, and I trusted you when you said nothing happened. Now I see I was a fool to believe you. That's why I left." "Oh God, Jesse," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I was the fool that night at the apartment. I was telling the truth. The only mistake I made was teasing Drake by saying I loved you. I wasn't going to let him into my apartment. I let him touch me earlier to make him less suspicious, but I was trying to keep him out when you showed up. That's what you saw. I swear I was telling the truth. Maggie took a deep breath and continued. That night at the party I messed up. I was angry and wanted to hurt you, but not by doing anything with Drake, just by making you jealous. I wasn't drunk, just a little tipsy, and I knew what I was doing. When I smiled, it was because I was happy you finally came for me. But when Drake got up and rushed at you, I realized everything was going wrong. That wasn't what I planned. I was so shocked I just sat there, and before I knew it, everything went to hell. The next thing I remember, I was at my parents' house. The next morning, I realized what I had done. You were gone, and I knew what you must have thought. She wiped her eyes, sniffling. I knew I had driven you away, and I couldn't find you. Emma cried herself to sleep for weeks, and I had no way to comfort her. I couldn't tell her I drove you away. I never stopped loving you, Jessie, and I haven't been with anyone else since you left. All the money you sent has been saved for Emma. I've lived here, waiting for you to come back. Now that you're here, I've said everything. It's up to you now. All I want is your forgiveness and for you to come back to me and our daughter. I sat there in disbelief at how easily she lied. Maggie had spent the night with Drake at least twice that I knew of, once when I was about to propose, and then the night of the party, probably even more times than that. She had always been good at lying, and tonight was no different. She had crafted this story to fit what she wanted me to believe. Maggie had made her choices, going out without me, sitting with Drake, drinking too much, and expecting me to come and rescue her without any consequences. When things spiraled out of control, she spent the night with him. She had always had feelings for him but chose me because she knew Drake wasn't husband material. When things got boring, she found a way to have both. She caused the fight and my decision to leave. But hadn't she paid a price? I had moved on, found a new life, made good friends, and even started a relationship with Stephanie. Meanwhile, Maggie had the chance to tell me the truth tonight, and instead, she lied again. Her regrets felt hollow. There was no chance I'd ever go back to her. I had made up my mind. Maggie, that car you came home in, it's Drake's old car. He gave it to you, didn't he? The other car in the driveway? It's the one I delivered to Drake's father earlier today, I said, my voice calm but sharp. His dad told me that Drake's been spending time with a woman whose husband ran off after cheating. Know anything about that, Maggie? Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. You were with Drake the night I almost proposed, and again at the party. Even your mother didn't know where you were that night. She believes your lies, just like everyone else. You claim you tried to call me, but my phone never rang. Why keep lying, Maggie? Let's be real. I made a mistake marrying you, but I'm over it. Once a cheater, always a cheater, right? Her tears were real this time, the kind that came with knowing the truth was out. I watched as shock turned to fear and finally to genuine pain. She knew it was over. Why are you crying, Maggie? I asked, my voice harsh. You ended us the night you cheated on me in front of everyone. You had to know I'd never take you back after that. Before then, maybe I didn't notice or I refused to see it. But that night? You made it public. You knew I wouldn't accept you with Drake or anyone else. I'm sorry, Jessie, she sobbed. I was angry, had too much to drink, and made a stupid mistake. Drake means nothing to me. You're the only man I've ever loved. Please forgive me. No, Maggie. I don't owe you forgiveness. It wasn't just a mistake, and it wasn't the first time you were with him. It started before we were married. Now, I don't even know if Emma is mine. Your lies and deceit have gone too far. Her sobbing intensified. No, Jessie. Emma is yours. I swear. I don't love Drake, and I'm not with him. He just gave me the car to help us. I've never been with him. You're wrong. I shook my head, no sympathy left. I'm not wrong, Maggie. You've lied to everyone, including your mother, Jake, and Janie. I believed you once, but that was my mistake. You were always drawn to the parties and the money. You spent the night with him when I was going to propose and came back pretending like nothing happened. I was blind because I loved you. Her tears kept flowing, but I felt nothing for her now. But I see clearly now. You cheated on me, and I'm done. Tomorrow I'll be gone, and I'll file for divorce as soon as I get back. I locked eyes with her, my words cutting deep. And I'll get a DNA test to make sure Emma is mine. If she's not, I'll sue you for fraud. Maggie's face paled. She whispered, Why, Jesse? Why would you think that? I've waited for you all this time, raising our daughter, saving everything you sent. Do you really think I've been lying? Yes, Maggie. I do, I said flatly. You've always lied. If you cared, you wouldn't have gone behind my back with Drake. It's too late now. I stood up, ready to leave. You can keep everything. The money, the trailer. I don't want any of it. But I'll demand my time with Emma. If you fight me on that, I'll make sure you and Drake pay. I'll agree to child support, but not a cent of alimony. I won't give you anything for him. Call me when you're ready for me to take Emma. She'll just hold you back. As I turned to leave, I heard a small voice. Daddy, is that you? I looked down and saw Emma, her wide eyes staring up at me. My heart sank. Yes, baby. It's Daddy. Hi, Daddy. Are you going to come home and live with us again? She asked, her voice full of hope. I hesitated, looking between her and Maggie. No, Pumpkin. I'm leaving tomorrow, but I'll visit you as often as I can. Okay? Tears filled her eyes. Why can't you stay, Daddy? I knelt down and gently took her hands. Mommy and I aren't going to be together anymore, but I'll still see you, I promise. Maggie, now composed, chimed in. That's right, sweetie. Daddy will visit you often. I fought to hold back my emotions as I hugged Emma, feeling a tug of old affection. I hugged Maggie one last time, her fragile frame clinging to me. She whispered, I'm so sorry, Jesse. Can you ever forgive me? I pulled back. No, Maggie. I'll never forgive you for destroying my relationship with Emma. I'll stay civil for her sake, but when she's old enough, I'll make sure she knows the truth about you. The horror on Maggie's face reflected how deeply my words cut, but I forced a smile. Take care of her. I'll send everything soon. I once loved you with everything I had, but now it's too late. Maggie sobbed. I don't know how I'll survive without you. I always believed you'd come back. I never stopped loving you. I sighed. I don't care anymore. As for Emma, I love her, but I need proof she's mine. Maybe you'll let her visit me. She'll like Sean and Billy, they're waiting for me now. I kissed Emma's forehead, gave Maggie one last look, and walked out to my car. As I drove off, I stopped the recording on my phone and sent it to her mother and Jake. No more lies. As I left the driveway, I saw Maggie standing in the doorway, watching me go. I waved goodbye. My only thought was, Sean, I'm coming home.